Hello, I'm Faye.
And I'm Becky. In this podcast, we're going to be talking about maximising your potential as a leader and living your best life personally and professionally.
So join us on the M53 for our weekly chats, full of insights and inspiration, and of course, a cuppa and a butty.
Faye, it's called a brew. Hello, and thank you for joining us again. On today's episode, we are going to be talking about boundaries. How we set boundaries, why they're so important, and why it is that people can struggle to keep boundaries. And when I mentioned to Faye that I thought boundaries would be a really good idea for an episode, she got really excited because she loves talking about boundaries. So Faye, what is it about boundaries that you love so much?
I'm not sure I really love talking about boundaries. I mean, if you went out with me...
Those were your words.
You went out for an evening with me, honestly, I won't be talking about boundaries. But I do like boundaries because they are so important. I have a blog on my website that I wrote for business owners, and there is a blog on there somewhere about boundaries. Because in our life, actually, with regard to anything that we do, we need our boundaries. And certainly, when we think about things like our self-care and when we think about looking after our own wellness, boundaries are a fabulous thing to actually put in place to help us in ourselves, but they also help us in our business. If we're a business owner, they help us in the job we do if we're employed. We have to have boundaries around what we do or who we are to enable ourselves to do things to the greatest effect, I think, that we possibly can. And our boundaries can become blurred. Our boundaries can be broken by other people. And it's up to us not to let that happen. And there are a few strategies that we will talk about in the podcast today of how we can not let that happen. But actually, Becky, you and I were just having a quick chat about this before we press record. And it's funny how even, I don't want to say even us as coaches, but even though we know what we know about boundaries, we still will let those boundaries be broken or be blurred. It's kind of happens subconsciously, doesn't it? It happens without us thinking. And then we look back and we think, oh, why did I let that happen? And it might be because we'd let our guard down around our boundaries.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that whole, even us as coaches, it goes back to my favourite saying, doesn't it? There's a big difference between knowing all the things and doing all the things. And so just because we know the importance of boundaries doesn't mean that we're perfect either. But I love what you said, Faye, around boundaries being really important for when it comes to our self-care. And I think, particularly from the industry that I used to work in, boundaries were seen, I think, as a bit of a weakness, that if people set up boundaries around their time or around the things that they were and weren't willing to do or willing to put up with, that was actually quite frowned upon often. And instead, having clear boundaries in place come from a real place of strength. It's my opinion that in order to set up and maintain your boundaries, you have to have a real understanding of your own self-worth, because that's where your boundaries come from, right? That something that is therefore important to you. And if you then don't understand or don't believe how important you are, then those boundaries are just going to get trampled all over left, right, and centre.
They will, absolutely. And so, yeah, it does start there, doesn't it? Your own self-worth, but your own self-worth within every aspect of your life. So it's about your own self-worth at home, if you're whoever you are at home, and your own self-worth within what you do for your career, your business, or whatever, with your clients, with your customers, with whoever you're working with your friends as well, and keeping those boundaries not as big blockades, but having little boundaries there that you come back to so that you can almost get like respite. So it's your respite, isn't it? It's your sense of relief. It's your chance to take a breath and breathe again and come back to who you are. Because otherwise we end up on the hamster wheel. If we don't have boundaries, we're on the hamster wheel, and we can have other people putting things in our diary, other people asking things of us, people expecting things of us. I think what's come into my head, what I'm thinking about is, personally, my husband plays in bands, and he plays in a few different bands. He goes to open mic night, he has rehearsals and things like that. And one thing that was really getting to me was the fact that he'd be out at certain times of the evening, and I would feel the need to get tea ready. So I've got a little boy and I've got my husband, and I would be working to his timetable all the time. Now, he can cook, but I tend to do most of the cooking. Now, that's just the way it is. He can cook. And what I've changed, and the boundary that I have in place now, is that we have a shared diary so that I can see when he's out, and I say to him, what are your plans for today in the morning? We actually say that to each other now. We have that conversation over our morning cup of tea. What are our plans for today? So we go through everything that's in our diaries, even though we have a lot of shared stuff set up. We can go and see it, but we talk it through. Right, so what time do you need to be out? So you need to, I'll say to him now, you need to go and get something out the freezer for tea. And he's just stopped saying to me, well, what should we have for tea? And I said, well, it's your choice. Whatever's in the freezer, whatever you fancy, get that out for tea, so that it defrosts in time, and I can then have a timetable in my head of what I need to cook and where I need to be, and work my diary out accordingly. I remember my mum saying to me, the trouble is you've got so many demands on your time, Faye, from other people. And it really hit home, because whilst I knew it, I hadn't acknowledged it. And it was at that point where I wanted to make some changes and wanted to give more responsibility to my husband for how his activities were impacting on me. And so, just a few little changes and I can do more, but I must make sure I get into the habit of doing these few changes for the time being. And then I can introduce more boundaries just to help my day flow a bit more effectively.
That's a really great example, actually, of how we can implement just something really small in your personal life to help set up your boundaries. I think that when you are employed, setting up those boundaries is, one, even more important, but two, can be that much harder. And the thing that's really springing to mind here is working hours. I think that's such a tricky line to balance. Again, depending on your industry. The words completely fell out of my head then. So depending on your industry, depending on your role, it can depend how much extra is expected of you. So from my background in construction, we had our contracted hours were 37.5 hours per week. But there was a nice clause in there around, whatever was required to get the project done. And I think that's pretty sneaky. I don't think it's uncommon though. But what that meant was you would regularly have people, I would have bosses who would be sending emails from the minute they got up. So 6 o'clock in the morning and before, emails would be landing, and they wouldn't be stopping until 10 o'clock at night. Now, I understand that wherever you work, there will be busy periods. And I think that everyone kind of expects busy periods, right? But that should not be your normal daily working life, that you are starting at 6 o'clock and you are still on the go at 10 p.m. And if you are having to work in that manner, if you can look yourself in the mirror and say that when I'm at work, I know that I'm working effectively. I'm not dossing about on Facebook. I'm not spending 2 hours a day having chats with my colleagues. I'm quite well organised with my time. If you are still having to significantly overwork and to do that for a prolonged period of time, that is not your problem. That is a problem for your employer. They do not have the right number of people to get the work done. It is really important, therefore, that you can get clear on your boundaries, because if you can look yourself in the mirror and say, I'm doing all these things really well that I should be doing, but I am not going to work 12 hours a day every day because I've got a life outside work, I've got family, I've got interests, I've got hobbies, damn it, I just need to sleep, then that needs to be taken to your employer. Your employer needs to make sure that they have the right number of people in to get that work done. But the more that people overwork, the more, in my experience, employers will just keep taking advantage of that. They will keep taking advantage of the fact that you will happily overwork because you haven't got those boundaries in place. I found it really difficult to establish my own boundaries around working hours. I think I got better at it once I had children, but then I felt a lot of guilt around my working hours. So I had this boundary, but I felt a lot of guilt. So because of how long it took to get into work, my commute was pretty horrific. And childcare venue opening times, I had a shorter working contract. I'd knocked a few hours a week off and would therefore generally arrive at work later. Or then as things shifted with my partner's work, instead I was there at normal time and I left 45 minutes early. And I found out that a number of my colleagues were actually talking about me then behind my back, and they were really disgruntled with the fact that I had shorter working hours. And again, remember, it was a very much male-dominated environment, so I was the only sort of female in that technical or management role within the team. And my boss had sort of brought it to my attention and said, but I want you to know I've spoken to them. I've spoken to the guys and we've had the chat around, well, when Becky leaves site, that's when her day then really starts, because that's when she's then she's getting the kids and she's doing all the stuff around the family things that you lot don't have to do, whether because their wives were stay at home or worked part-time, or because their children were older. So they didn't have that in place, and they didn't have that, that pressure on their time. However, looking back, I think it's strange that the fact that I did have a boundary on my time was so looked down on. What's that all about?
It is strange, and it's wrong. It's inherently wrong. And it's happened because we've let this creep in organisations, in business, and it's become the norm. It's become the way that we feel that we've got to work because everybody else does. So maybe it does need for one person to make that change. My old boss tried to make that change, and he was brilliant at it. And you're going to hear me talking about the things he used to do in this podcast a lot, because he did a lot of stuff right. He wasn't, don't get me wrong, he wasn't, the most, he was a lovely, lovely human being. He wasn't probably the most brilliant person that landed on this earth, but he was absolutely fantastic in his leadership and management to his team. And he used to have, I would say, a 50 to 60 minute commute morning and evening. And he used to get into work literally just before our day would start, and he used to leave on time. And he used to say to the rest of us, if you are still here, if you're here before I get in, or you're still here after I've gone, then I'm doing my job wrong. Yeah, wow. And sometimes we would stay to get a job done, and obviously he'd get that. He'd say, well, if you're just staying to finish X, Y, and Z off, great, but don't stay too long. It can be finished in the morning, But what that meant was that we were all so willing to put in that extra time when we needed to, because we used to go to a lot of breakfast, networking meetings. We used to do evening things. We would stay to stuff envelopes to help another team out, or for our own team, stuffing envelopes that had to go out and get out in the post for marketing things. Whatever it was, we felt that we wanted to put our all in to help get things done, because it wasn't expected that we would be in at the crack of dawn and stay until whatever time in the evening. And, and I go back to when I said it's wrong. It is wrong. Becky, you said you were paid to work 37 and a half hours, and putting in a little bit of time over that is fine. But to be expected to then work so many hours a week more and not be remunerated for it, well, the contract is then wrong, isn't it? That's how I see it.
But there was that nice little clause in the contract, and that was how they got around it. And I must admit, Faye, I did have a boss like you who it was very much. I worked for him after I'd had my first child, and I originally went back on 3 days a week, and so we had to have some really, really open and honest chats around boundaries then, and around the workload that I could actually achieve. I don't know if anyone else has gone back to work part-time. I didn't have any less work to do. I just had less hours to do it. Therefore, other things had to be dropped. It was very much my focus was on this specific package that I was running. And again, he was great. In fact, he fought my corner. The director of that part of the business hadn't wanted to let me go back part-time. It was completely unheard of. No one worked part-time in the business. Certainly no one in any kind of engineering or management role. It was completely alien. And bearing in mind, my daughter's only 6. We're not talking about going back 30 years here. We're talking about going back 5 years ago. Because she was 1 when I went back to work. But again, what that meant was the fact that this guy had my back so much and respected those constraints on my time. It meant that when something came up, let's say a client meeting, that could not be rescheduled, I knew that he had done everything in his power to try and reschedule that for the day that I was working. But if something had happened and it just could not be done, and he therefore asked me to come in, I think, Faye, it probably happened maybe 3 times in the year that I worked part-time. I worked 3 days a week initially and then 4 days a week. It probably happened 3 times in a year. I was happy to do it. I was happy to do it because he showed respect for my boundaries at all other times. So therefore, yeah, I'll come in. I'll do the extra, put her in the extra day in childcare. It's not a problem. Happy to do it. Because we have those times. So we know that boundaries are really important when it comes to our self-care, so that we don't end up resenting the people that we're working for, or resenting other people that are asking for our time. This isn't just about as an employer, around other things in our lives, and we don't end up burning out. But what are the benefits of having boundaries? And I think that the first one that comes to mind for me is that boundaries can actually build trust. So, for example, if you have that really open communication with someone in your team, there's a certain amount of work that needs to be done, for example, okay? And they say to you, okay, I can do these 2 projects in that time. You can trust that work will be done, rather than having a team member who, all right, I think I can do it, or I might be able to do it. And maybe they try and squeeze in 3 tasks, but they're not done to the best of their ability because they didn't feel that they could say no to the 3rd task because they knew really that they could only get 2 done. It builds trust. You know what can be done and you know what to expect from other people. I think that's a real advantage of having those boundaries in place and being able to have those conversations around boundaries.
We had a conversation before we hit record, didn't we, Becky, about the word no being a full sentence.
Oh, yeah.
And we had quite an interesting conversation because in my head, I said to you, you said, is no a full sentence? And I said, yes, no is a full sentence. And then I went on to talk about how I actually don't use no as a full sentence, how I always justify my no. And I'm going to challenge myself to stop justifying my no, because it doesn't need to be justified. You had a nice story about this, didn't you, with somebody that uses no as a full sentence and somebody who doesn't.
Yeah. It came from a conversation with my eldest sister a couple of years ago, and she was talking about one of her friends who uses no as a full sentence. This lady is called Kim, and both Kim and my sister are very active in their church community. And so as such, they can often be asked to do things, to take part in events, to provide things, it could be transport, it could be food, it could be whatever, a whole host of things. And how my sister would really struggle with saying no, because when she would say no, she would, like Faye said, which I think is something that's really human that a lot of us do, no, I can't do it because XYZ, I'm really sorry. Oh, but what would happen then is the person would come back and throw that justification out the window with an example of how someone else who was in a much worse situation was still managing to take part. And yet her friend Kim, who just said, no, I can't do it, that was it. End of discussion. And I remember when my sister first said this to me about no being a full sentence, I was like appalled. I thought, can't do, surely you've got to say no, I'm really sorry, I can't. And then I thought, but why do you need to be sorry? Why do we need to be sorry that we can't do something? Maybe sometimes we genuinely are sorry. Maybe it is literally just one plate too many to spin. But actually, do you need to then be sorry about that? I don't know. I don't really think that you do. And it's one of those things that I've really thought on over those past couple of years. It's often popped up around, can no be a full sentence? I'm rubbish at it. I'll hold my hand up here. I'm rubbish at using no as a full sentence.
And especially really lately, I've heard a lot of people say, I can't do this because I've got this going on, I've got that going on. And then, like you said, that justification being thrown out the window, somebody will then turn around and say, well, we're all busy, but I managed to fit these things in. And then you feel really bad because you're busy and maybe you just don't want to fit in that extra thing. And that's okay. It's actually okay not to want to do something. And is it letting somebody down if they've asked you and they've said, I'm in deep here, I could really do with some help? Then you might, you might say, well, I'm busy, but yeah, I can fit that in. But if it's just somebody coming to you for something that could be done at some other time or could be done by somebody else, is it wrong to say no?
And I think it's really important here to recognise that when you are then starting to build your own boundaries in, so let's say whatever that is, maybe you are a person who's like, do you know what, I'm gonna take this on. I'm going to start using no as a full sentence and stop justifying it, or whatever it is, whatever this boundary is, you then equally have to respect the boundaries of others. So if you ask someone to do something and they just give you a no, you need to respect that that's their boundary too. You can't have it both ways. You can't have all the boundaries and then not respect other people's. And a question to ask yourself around building your boundaries, and when it looks like they're going to be pushed, when you've got a decision to make, if I say yes to this, what am I saying no to? So if I say yes to this, what am I saying no to? We all only have a certain amount of time. We only have a certain amount of resources. The more things that we say yes to, the more things that inevitably we're going to have to say no to in order to be able to fulfill that yes. So if you say yes to this, what are you saying no to? What's more important?
It might be that you're saying no to your exercise class, helping your children with their homework, reading to your child bedtime, or caring for elderly people or whatever. There's so many things. It could be a decent meal. It could be time to read. It could be anything that is actually important, but quite often we'll think, well, I've been asked to do this, I'm going to say yes to it because actually reading a chapter of my book can be done at any time. But if that's something that you hold important to you, then question what you're saying no to.
Do you know, just before we close, I've just popped into my head a great example from the boss that I talked about from after I'd had my first child, and one of the boundaries that he had in place. Again, I could probably count on both hands the number of lunch breaks I had throughout my entire career. They just weren't a thing. You worked through your lunch. However, this boss, every day, 12 o'clock on the dot, would leave his desk and he would go and sit in the canteen. And he was available for people to talk to about anything other than work. He probably stayed there for maybe 20 minutes. But in that 20 minutes, it was really clear, happy to chat to you about the weekend, the weather, politics, whatever you want, not about work. This is 20 minutes that I take out of my day for myself. And I loved that. I absolutely loved that model of 20 minutes. It's not a lot.
It's not a lot. And I'm sitting here thinking, what happened during that 20 minutes? Did he get 20 minutes less work done throughout the day? Was the organisation then less effective because he took 20 minutes out to eat? Or was the organisation and himself more effective because he'd actually managed to switch his brain to something else, refuel his body, nourish himself, have that time and a little bit of space just to collect his thoughts, get himself back into gear, and then go forth? I bet, 20 minutes a day, that's an hour and 40 minutes a week. Extrapolate that, throughout a year. I'm not going to do the maths while we're on the podcast.
Come on, Faye.
No. But you get the picture, don't you? Actually, what did the organisation lose out on? Did they lose out on that time? I think, for me, lunchtimes are very important. I did always, no, not always, that would be an utter lie. I did often take my lunch, and I used to go away from the organisation. I spent quite a few years working at home. And at that time, I was in a different house, and I used to come down from the loft. I had to get to the kitchen. I had to come down from the loft. But it was great because I could just move away from my working environment. And when I was at work, when I was in the office, I used to go somewhere else and just to pick up some food and eat it. And then you come back, you're refreshed. You have time to think about what you're doing that afternoon, what you need to do, how you're going to get stuff done. It's amazing how good that is for you, but not just you, everyone else around you as well. Who wants to sit with a person who's eating fish pie at their desk? You don't want to do that. We've all been there.
There's always one. Mackerel was always the one that killed me. But think about, as we wrap up today, so think about, as a leader, what kind of example do you want to be setting to your team? Do you want to be glorifying overworking and stress? Or do you want to show that you have boundaries, that having boundaries come from a place of strength? They come from a place of understanding your own self-worth, and that ultimately they lead to better trust in your team and to being able to have really good, clear communication on what can and can't be done, for respecting other people and their needs, and for ultimately being able to work together in a much more effective way.
Definitely. And enjoy the process, enjoy setting them up, and enjoy rolling them out.
Thank you for listening to Meet Me on the M53. If you'd like to know more, you can see Becky at questforest.co.uk and Faye at fayeblakey.com.
Don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss an episode, and thank you to Wahoo Media for our production. We'll see you next time on the M53.
Safe travels.